Today, on Pat's Car Garage, a heretic, blasphemous, contentious episode on Mercedes front wheel bearings. The internet has spoken, and we now know for a fact that the wrath of incorrectly setting up your wheel bearings and using not Mercedes-approved wheel bearing grease shall bring upon us the swift end of civilization, descending the cosmos into darkness and chaos that can only be matched by the heat death of the universe. Right. As you can tell, some people take themselves far too seriously, and today I will show you that you needn't participate in such madness, and setting up wheel bearings is quite easy. My motivation for this claim is that every single person you ask has set up wheel bearings differently, and nobody seems to ever have any issues. One can only derive the conclusion that any minor effort to do things right is sufficient to do your wheel bearings correctly. On a serious note, replacing wheel bearings is honestly as difficult as changing spark plugs. With that being said, jack the car up, place some jack stands under the control arms. Remember, safety third. But seriously, safety first. Probably. Remove the tire, then the brake caliper and the brake rotor. Loosen the set screw on the wheel bearing nut, then remove the wheel bearing nut and pull the hub off the spindle. You just saw me hammer the outer bearing race out on the floor. Then, in a bench vise, use a flat screwdriver to pry out the inner wheel seal. Finally, you can hammer out the inner bearing race. Clean out all the old grease out of the hub and off the spindle. To hammer the new bearing races in, you can use a bearing race tool like I'm showing here. These are quite cheap. Or, if you don't want to spend the money, you can just use the old bearing race to hammer against to drive the new race into the hub. Start with lighter taps. The races love to go in crooked. If you go slowly, you can level them out until they are far enough into the hub that you can just pound them in all the way. You will hear and feel the race bottom out in the hub. Don't put the inner wheel seal on yet. The bearing has to go in first, which we still need to grease. Now, we'll just flip the hub around and hammer in the outer bearing race. Now we need to pack the wheel bearings full of grease. I'm using the tried and true method of picking up a glob of grease and squishing the bearing into my palm until grease comes out the rollers on the other side. You'll notice that I'm not using Mercedes approved grease. How could you? Well, nobody cares. When buying grease for your bearings, just make sure of three things. It's the correct viscosity, so NLGI number 2 in this case. It's GCLB, the highest grade of grease possible, and it says extreme pressure or EP somewhere on the box. $20 for this giant tub of grease that will last me a lifetime. The thickener doesn't really matter, like either get lithium complex or calcium sulfonate, both of them will be fine. Put the inner wheel bearing into the hub and put the inner wheel seal afterwards. Make sure you don't forget the bearing before putting the seal in, please. I used a block of wood and a hammer to tap the seal in until it's flush with the hub. When reassembling the hub, spread a coat of grease on the spindle and put some grease inside the hub. Don't fill the hub completely with grease, just lather on a thick layer over everything. Think of it this way, too much is better than not enough. Insert the outer wheel bearing into the hub and push it all the way in. Now comes the contentious part, setting the wheel bearing. Here's how I've done it. I've used a pair of vice grips to tighten the nut until the hub would not move freely. Then I would rotate the hub a few turns forwards and then backwards, which would free up the hub again, allowing me to tighten the hub further. I repeat this until I cannot tighten the nut anymore. You should never really be putting too much force on the vice grips when doing this. Once the nut no longer feels like going further, you should stop. Now, you would back the nut off until the hub moves freely again and feels like it's sloppy. Tighten the nut with your thumb and index finger, hand tight only. This should remove any free play in the hub, and the hub will turn easily, but there will be a slight amount of resistance to it. That's it. Tighten the lock bolt on the nut, and you are ready to reassemble everything else. The last thing to do before I end this video is to put the dust caps on. Spread a layer of grease over the inside of the cap and tap it into place. That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed the video, and keep in mind, this is a very easy job to do, but it is also way too easy to fall into analysis paralysis.